Awesome. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Worldviews. Today we have on Jimmy Akin. Jimmy is a Christian apologist and senior apologist for the largest Catholic apologist media company in the world, otherwise known as Catholic Answers. He is the author of several books and a podcast host of his show, Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where he explores things such as the supernatural, ancient mysteries, folk tales, and urban legends. Jimmy, thank you for coming on Worldviews.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Jimmy, can we go ahead and just get started on how you first came to Christ and eventually came to Catholicism?
So I was born in Texas and I grew up in Arkansas and I was raised nominally Protestant. My family was Church of Christ, which is a denomination that we have here in the South, although they don't like being called a denomination. But they were Church of Christ till I was about 6 or 7 years old, and they had some kind of falling out with the elders of the church. And after that, we stopped going. So I was raised nominally Protestant after that. When I was in my teenage years, I was New Ager. But when I was 20 years old, I had a profound conversion to Christ and came back to the Christian faith and became very active in it. My goal was to devote my life to studying and teaching God's word. I planned on becoming a Protestant seminary professor and or pastor, but I had made a point of studying the theologies of all different kinds of Christians because I realized that even though we got about 1,000,003 churches here in Fayetteville, Arkansas, which one of them is within convenient driving distance or has music I like or a preacher I like or things like that, none of that's a real good test of theological truth. And what I was interested in was what's true. And so I'd made a point of studying the theologies of all different branches of Christianity. And one day I was reading a book that it happened to be a Catholic book, but it had an extended passage from Matthew 16 in it. That's the "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church" passage. And I'd always said that Peter is not the rock, that the rock is the revelation that Jesus is the Messiah. And I had ways of arguing that, but this particular day, as I was looking over the passage again, I realized that there were structural features in the text that are so obvious that they're even there in English. You don't have to go to the Greek. And they require that Jesus is talking about Peter when he says the rock. And so I concluded, well, if Peter is the rock on which Jesus builds his church, then that means once Jesus goes back to heaven, Peter is the one left in charge. And whoever is in charge of the earthly church in Jesus' absence, that's a good description of the office of the Pope. And so I had to conclude that Catholics were right about Peter being the first Pope. Whether there were any later popes was, an open question. That was something I still had to investigate. But I realized that I needed to do a thorough review of all of the categories of systematic theology with an open mind to whether the Catholic understanding of them might be true. So I took a year in grad school and basically did that. I kind of, coasted through my classes and then spent all my free time studying systematic theology. And at the end of that review, I concluded that the Catholic understanding on issue after issue was correct, and I needed to become a Catholic. So I did.
And in the beginning of your story, you mentioned a profound conversion. Can you walk us through what made that so profound?
Well, it was profound in the sense that I took the Christian faith really seriously for the first time in my life. I mean, I can tell you about the particulars of how it happened if you want, but basically, it was just a very deep appropriation of the Christian faith, as illustrated by the fact that I didn't just fall into one school of theology reflectively. Instead, I made a point of studying the different branches of Christian thought in order to try to get the best understanding of the truth that I could get.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting because it sounds like it was would you describe it as almost like a supernatural thing or no?
Well, I think that God's hand is in everything that happens in our lives, and so I think there was a supernatural dimension to it. I didn't perceive it as being particularly supernatural at the time, not in a detectable, discernible, obvious way to human reason. But in hindsight, I think, yeah, God's hand was definitely in it.
Mm. And your whole New Age era of your life too, was New Age back in your time pretty similar belief systems as it is today? Or was there anything that was kind of different back then that's not really adopted today as a belief within the
Well,
New Age? I know it vastly varies amongst people, but generally, I guess speaking.
Well, the New Age is kind of an Americanized appropriation of certain Eastern religious traditions, Eastern in the sense of Far East Asia, like Hinduism, Buddhism, things like that, that really are not well understood by many in the New Age movement itself, but it's an attempt to appropriate some of their ideas. And it was something I flirted with when I was a teenager. What flavor of New Age movement you're going to be involved with is going to be heavily dependent on which New Age circles you were in, because it's not a coherent, organized belief system. It's a sort of loose collection of beliefs. The particular form that I was interested in was centered around the thought of a 20th century psychic named Edgar Casey, who had lived in the early 20th century, and he had left a bunch of books behind, and so I would read his books and things like that.
Okay. And going into sort of the Catholicism piece, do you have like a sort of sales pitch for how you pitch Catholicism to Protestants?
Well, I don't generally pitch it as much as just ask, respond to people's questions. I answer loads and loads of questions from people about it. But if I were to compress it into sort of an elevator pitch, I would say that basically Christianity's original form is Catholicism. Jesus said that he would build his church and the gates of hell would not prevail against it. And when you study the way the term church is used in the Gospels, it's used in the Gospel of Matthew. We can very clearly tell from Matthew that Jesus is talking about what is sometimes called an earthly church or a visible church. He is not talking about an invisible union of all spiritual believers. Instead, when you look at the relevant passages that actually use the term, it is an organization that has a defined membership, that has leaders and followers, that people can be incorporated into or expelled from, that has laws governing the behaviors of its members. And so we're clearly talking about a visible institution. And so Jesus said the gates of hell would not prevail against it. The gates of hell, Hades in Greek, being the place of the dead. It's not the place of the damned, it's the place of the dead. And so that means that his church is never going to die. So we've got a visible institution that is founded on St. Peter that is never going to die and therefore must have existed for the last 2,000 years. And when you do the math, that's the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church is OG Christianity, and if you Jesus said he would be guiding his church and the Holy Spirit would be guiding his church until the end of time. And so if you want to understand Christianity the way Jesus proclaimed it, you need to be looking at Catholicism.
Whoa. Okay. The Hades and hell piece. So does that mean do you think are you like an annihilationist then?
Oh no, of course not.
Okay. Okay.
No, I just point out because the difference, because today people in colloquial English, now originally in English, the word hell just meant the place of the dead. And so everybody who died went to hell. That's why in the Apostles' Creed, we say Jesus descended into hell. We mean he died. He went to the place of the dead. We don't mean he went to the place of suffering and torment and the lake of fire and stuff like that. We just mean he died. And so when Jesus says the gates of hell are not going to prevail against his church, he means the gates of death. His church is never going to die.
Mm, okay. And for Catholics and Protestants, is there anything that you believe Protestants actually do a better job than Catholics, for example? I was told that overall priest told me that he believes Protestants do a better job at learning scripture.
Well, this is something that is I mean, it involves a kind of top level generalization where we're talking about Catholics as a group versus Protestants as a group. The trouble is, there is an enormous amount of diversity in both groups, but there's especially a huge amount of diversity in Protestantism. So you look at a high church Anglican, they are very much not like a low church Assemblies of God Pentecostal. And so there is just a huge spectrum of different beliefs and practices, particularly in the Protestant community. And that makes top level generalizations very difficult. There are things that individual groups of Protestants do better than individual groups of Catholics. And there are things that individual groups of Catholics do better than individual groups of Protestants. But it's very hard to make top line generalizations because you have to kind of confine yourself to, like, what are the rudiments of this system that can incorporate all the diversity within a given community. And when you're doing that kind of top line level analysis, I don't see anything that the Protestant community as a whole does that is superior to what the Catholic community as a whole does. I think there are trends in particular groups where either Protestants do something better or Catholics do something better, but that's a more fine-grained analysis that's not on the top level line.
Okay, let's go more specific then. How about non-denominational versus Catholics? That'd be better.
Oh, well, non-denominationals themselves have an enormous amount of theological diversity among them. Non-denominationals, I mean, you have the Church of Christ, for example. They're one type of non-denominational, but they believe in baptismal regeneration, and they don't believe, many of them, in instrumental music, and many of them believe if you're not baptized in their Church of Christ, then you're damned. On the other hand, you've got a lot of non-denominationals who are basically Baptists with the name filed off. And so you have a lot of diversity within groups that call themselves non-denominational. Um, but if you're thinking of, say, typical American evangelicals, I think a lot of American evangelicals do study scripture more than typical American Catholics. I think that's to their credit. I also think that they are generally bolder about their faith in proclaiming it to others. That doesn't mean they always do it the right way, but they're bolder about it, and that's good. So I give them points on evangelization. On the other hand, in terms of doctrinal correctness, I think Catholics are doing that better. So, it depends on the group you're talking about. Also, Catholics tend to be better about engaging the intellectual life. If you look at prominent thought leaders in different fields, like in law, or in academia or things like that, the Catholics tend to be better about engaging the world of the mind and incorporating insights from other fields. There's more of a defensiveness in Protestant circles here in America that tends to result in either not necessarily an anti-intellectualism, but at least less intellectual engagement in the United States than in some other places.
Okay. And when Protestants challenge about Catholicism, are their main gripes usually having to do with, say, Mary being sinless, or is
Well,
that like the number one thing?
that's certainly one of them, but there are a bunch of others too. I mean, the sort of the top five would be the Pope, justification, sola scriptura, Mary, and purgatory.
Okay, cool. And from a Christianity as a whole standpoint, what subject matter within Christianity have you changed your mind on the most? What's the biggest subject that you changed your mind on?
Whether one should be Catholic or not. I mean, that's the big one for me. And, when other things tend to fall into place once you get that one sorted out.
So you never like dove into, or you never changed your mind on something such as, I don't know, like free will versus predestination, anything along those lines, maybe more
Oh,
philosophical
oh,
points.
sure. I mean, I at the time that just before I became Catholic, I was a Calvinist. I was attending a conservative Presbyterian church, and even though I'd studied the theologies of all different branches of Christianity regarding grace and free will and so forth, I had adopted conservative Presbyterian views, and so I was a Calvinist. And initially, that didn't need to be too much of a dividing line because there are versions of Catholic thought that are very similar to Calvinism. Specifically, the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas is similar. It's not identical, but it is similar to what you have in Calvinism. And so I needed to modify a few things, but I didn't need to really revisit the issue of grace and free will in a big way, because there are versions of Catholic thought that are, broadly speaking, compatible with Calvinistic thought on this. So I didn't initially have to make too much of an adjustment in that area. What I did do, though, was I put a big focus, especially, and this is true throughout my career, but it's something I adopted early on. I put a big focus on teaching what the Catholic Church teaches and bracketing anything else. So, if you want to know my opinion on a given
Sure, yeah.
theological matter, I'll tell you my opinion, but I'm going to bracket it as this is my opinion. This is not church teaching, because I don't want to put a bigger barrier between. I don't want to misrepresent the church and what it teaches, and I don't want to put a bigger barrier between anybody in the church than the church does. And so I make a point of saying, well, here's what the church teaches. Here we have a range of, and then in addition to that, here we have a range of opinions. And this one happens to be mine, but there are other opinions. And if you have another opinion, that's fine. So I put a big emphasis on, when it came to issues like grace and predestination and free will, I would sketch what the church teaches, and then I would kind of sketch the range of possibilities for individuals beyond that. But I didn't tend to express my own opinion unless asked. More recently, I have returned to this subject and have become much more persuaded that Calvinism and Thomism and Augustinianism, which Thomism kind of flows from in this context, are mistaken in their interpretation of various biblical passages. And I have adopted a position that is much more in line with libertarian free will, that sees, if I were to translate it into Protestant terms, it's much more like Arminianism than it is Calvinism in terms of my personal views. So that's an issue where I have had a big change. It took a long time, and for many years I didn't devote a lot of attention to the subject. But as I've re-engaged the subject with a more mature grasp of scriptural exegesis, I think the Calvinist interpretations of various passages do not stand up well. And so, if I were using Protestant language, now Catholics don't use this language, but if I were using Protestant language, I would say at this point I'm basically an Arminian.
Okay. And going down that philosophical route as well, what philosophical questions, because you're clearly a very deep thinker and always have been, what philosophical questions do you wrestle with the most?
Well, I don't. These days, I'm not working professionally in the field of philosophy. I mean, that's what my academic training is in. So I've done lots of thought about philosophy, but these days I'm not working in the field professionally, and so I don't spend a lot of time wrestling with philosophical issues. When I do think about them, particularly when they come up, I'm not a I'm not a member of any particular school philosophically. I mean, my training is in analytic philosophy, but I'm a Christian analytic philosopher. And so it's really more of a method that I use than a set of views to adopt. Analytic philosophy involves the careful analysis of terminology and following logical steps and so forth. But that doesn't tell you what you end up believing. That just is more of a method of how to do philosophical thought. as opposed, for example, to existentialism, which is what you tend to find in continental European philosophy. So these days, I don't do a lot of writing and thinking about purely philosophical subjects. Um, but I would say that one's areas of philosophical thought that tend to crop up a good bit in my work are things like the existence of God and the problem of evil and things like that. So I do devote thought to those, but I think I have pretty substantial answers. So I don't know that I wrestle exactly in this area. I also have my own views of some philosophical topics that don't fit neatly into any existing system. Like in epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge, how do you know something? Um, I think that I actually think that the field of epistemology has been fundamentally misframed since the time of Plato, and that the classic Platonic definition of knowledge as a justified true belief is fundamentally misframed. I think that Plato confused two different questions, which is what's actually true versus what, objectively speaking, and what is a subjective belief about what is objectively true. So, an individual who, I'm trying to address this subject in a way that's not too technical, but like a classic question in epistemology would be something like, does Jones know X? Where X is some belief. And Plato would say, well, if Jones believes X, and if he has a justification for his belief, some reason to think X, and if X is actually true, then Jones does know X for Plato. But in the 20th century, in the 1960s, a man named Edmund Gettier came along and found counterexamples where Jones does believe X. And like the classic example is Jones owns a Ford, a Ford automobile. And so Jones or someone believes that Jones owns a Ford. His justification is he sees Jones driving a Ford, and it happens to be true that Jones owns a Ford. But the Ford that someone saw Jones driving one day did not belong to Jones. It was a rental car because Jones's own Ford was in the shop. And so his Jones owns a Ford belief is based on a bad justification. So merely having a justification for something that happens to be true and that you believe, we wouldn't really want to say he knows that Jones owns a Ford on the basis of seeing Jones driving a rental car that happened to be a Ford. And so there's something missing in the definition of knowledge. And that led to a kind of attempt or quest to find what extra fourth condition of knowledge can we come up with to patch this, so that we can add something to justified true belief, and that will be knowledge. And lots of people propose different kinds of conditions, and none of them worked really well. And my conclusion is that the question has been fundamentally misframed, because what we're not attending to here is the question: who is making this assessment? That let's say Peter knows that Jones owns a Ford. I know I'm changing my names around. I apologize. But let's say Peter knows that Jones owns a Ford. Okay, well, if Peter has a justified true belief, that kind of looks like knowledge, but there's something missing. The problem involves is that we're not attending to who is themselves making the assessment of Peter's knowledge claim, because I can look at Peter's knowledge claim as an outsider and say, well, it looks good to me or it looks bad to me, but I can't escape my own subjectivity. And so unless we're God, we don't have unlimited access to the truth. we don't have omniscience. And so all we have as subjective individuals is our own set of knowledge claims. And so rather than saying something, so we don't have independent access to truth. All we have access to is the justifications for our beliefs. And so I would say that what we should do is define knowledge as a well justified belief. And we each see that from our own perspective. So Peter could say, yeah, I know Jones owns a Ford. I saw him driving one. Okay, well, for Peter, that's a subjectively valid claim. But for me, who knows it's a rental car that Jones was driving, I would say, no, that's not you don't really know it on that basis. But that's just me looking at it. But I happen to know he's also got his own Ford is in the shop. So I think that in order to disentangle the problem of knowledge, you have to look at who is making the knowledge claim. And since we don't have independent access to what is true, all we can do is look at it in terms of, is this belief well justified or not? Peter would think, oh, yeah, my claim is well justified. I saw him driving a Ford. Since I know that was a rental car, would say, actually, it's not a well justified belief, but I have an additional justification. I know that Jones bought a Ford that is currently in the shop. And so really all we've got access to as subjective non-divine individuals is justified beliefs. And so I would say knowledge is best defined in terms of justified beliefs, and we don't have access to objective truth as non-divine individuals.
How long did that take you to come to that conclusion?
I don't know. I thought of it back in grad school, and I haven't really changed since then. So I'd guess, I mean, it came to me kind of in a flash. Figuring out the best way to articulate it is a little more challenging, but I saw it pretty quickly once I started thinking about the issue, that it looks like we've got a conflation of two different domains here.
Interesting. Wow. Okay. Well, let's talk about your debate life. You debated Christians and atheists alike over numerous topics.
Mhm.
What would you say has been your favorite debate you've ever done?
Hmm. I would say probably, and I don't really think in terms of favorites. That's just not how my mind is organized. But I would say probably, if I had to pick one, probably my debate with Bart Ehrmann over the reliability of the Gospels. I thought that was a very stimulating debate. I thought that it went very well. Bart was a nice guy. There wasn't any personal acrimony. In fact, he and I have both, said nice things about each other subsequent to the debate. So I'd probably say that one.
What was that point you made in that debate about the whole idea of, I think it was like Mary and Joseph living in two different spots that
Mhm.
Bart had
Yeah.
a challenge on that? Can you explain that?
Yeah, so Bart's basic argument is that the Gospels are not reliable, and I would say this is not a persuasive argument. Even if it worked, it's not a persuasive argument, because this is not about a major claim regarding Jesus. Both the Gospels of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew agree that Jesus was born in Bethlehem but raised in Nazareth. And so the question is, how do they get from one place to another? Well, that is a very minor question. Why did they move to this? I mean, if we know he was born here but grew up here, like I was born in Corpus Christi, Texas, but I grew up in Fayetteville, Arkansas. Um, if you're writing the biography of Jimmy Akin and you say he was born in Corpus Christi but raised in Fayetteville, okay, fine, but those are notable facts about me, but they're fairly minor facts. And the question of exactly why did his parents move from one place to another when he was a child? That's a lower order question. And so merely showing that a document has lower order imprecisions is not sufficient to show it is fundamentally unreliable. That's a much greater claim. If someone wrote a biography of Jimmy Akin and they had it right that I was born in Corpus Christi but raised in in Fayetteville. And one source said that I was born in Corpus Christi because my parents were there on vacation. And another source said I was born in Corpus Christi because my dad had a teaching assignment there when I was born. It doesn't really matter so much which one of those is true. They're both lower order. And so even if there were a mistake on this level, it's not going to prove the biography of Jimmy Akin is fundamentally mistaken, just because of a lower order issue like this. So even if Bart's argument worked, I don't think it proves his case. But his argument was Matthew, if you read Matthew alone, you could interpret it as saying that Joseph and the Holy Family started in Bethlehem and then later moved to Nazareth because of political circumstances in Judea. On the other hand, in Luke's version, it makes it clear they're from Bethlehem. I'm sorry, they're from Nazareth and they moved to Bethlehem and then they moved back to Nazareth. Now, and Bart thinks there's a conflict there, that they say two different things. And specifically, Luke mentions them going to Bethlehem on account of the census that was conducted under, or the enrollment, to use a better translation, the enrollment that was conducted under Caesar Augustus. And so Bart thinks there's a conflict here. I don't think there's any conflict here. I think Matthew just omits the fact that they had lived in Nazareth before they went down to Bethlehem. And so he's just given us an incomplete account of something that Luke gives more fully. In terms of why they went to Bethlehem for the enrollment, I think it's very straightforward in Luke. Luke indicates they had a residence in Nazareth, which is up in Galilee, and Luke indicates that that they went to Bethlehem because of the enrollment that they were required to participate in, and that this was also Joseph's own city. So Joseph had a connection to Bethlehem at the time. And the most natural reading of that is he had a residence there. And Bart thought this was unexpected. He confessed he'd never thought of this before, but he then immediately envisioned them being like a rich family that could have, maintain multiple homes and things like that, which is often what we think about today. But this is when we imagine someone having two homes, we imagine they're rich. But this is not the way it works with migrant labor. With migrant laborers all over the world, whether that's here in America or in Africa or in Asia or in Europe, people have a home where they're from. So, like if there's a couple in, let's say, Sinaloa, Mexico, that migrates up to Los Angeles for migrant work, well, they've got a home in Sinaloa. That's their family home. That's where their family is from. And so that's what they consider their home. If you ask them, where are you from? They're going to say, I'm from Sinaloa, not I'm from Los Angeles. But they go to Los Angeles for work and they don't sleep on the street when they're in Los Angeles. They may be dirt poor, but they find somewhere that they can afford and they live there while they're in Los Angeles for work. And so the Gospels make it clear that Mary and Joseph were poor. Luke makes that clear when he indicates Mary gave the offering when Jesus was born of like a couple of doves, which was the offering you made if you were poor. And so we know they were poor. And Luke tells us they were from Nazareth, and Joseph in particular was from Bethlehem. And so he had some kind of family ties in Bethlehem that would require him to go there as his place of legal residence for the enrollment. And then they lived the rest of the time in Nazareth for work. And so this is a perfectly understandable pattern in light of how migrant workers actually function all over the world, in the real world, even today.
Okay. That's super interesting. That was, like, my favorite part of the debate for some reason, just
Mhm.
because it was such a because it wasn't like it was a theory either. It was just like this could easily be what the truth actually is. Uh, but moving on to who do you think was the smartest person you ever debated?
Oh, I don't think in those terms. I there are certainly people I've debated that are smarter than others. I tend to forget the names of the people who are not as smart. Um, I would say amongst the smarter people I've debated are Bart Ehrmann and James White. Um, Other people I've debated have either not been as smart or have not been as experienced yet.
Mm. Do you have a ideal or dream person to debate over a specific topic?
Not really. I tend to take debates as they come. Um, I One that I wouldn't mind doing in the future is one that Bart actually proposed himself, because he recently did a course on the Book of Acts, which he actually likes. He doesn't think it's historically reliable, but he really likes the Book of Acts. I really like the Book of Acts, and I think it's historically reliable. And Bart himself suggested in a podcast, oh, maybe Jimmy and I can debate that. So, I'd be happy to debate him again on Acts. I think that
Okay,
could be fun.
cool, cool. And I wanna talk about your podcast, Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, because I think it's such a fascinating sort of, podcast. What inspired you to start that exactly?
Well, I grew up in the 1970s, and back then there were lots of like documentaries on TV that I would see when I was a kid about UFOs and Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster and everything like that. And so I've always had an interest in mysterious subjects. And about 6.5 years ago, I guess, the StarQuest production network, which is one of the podcasting networks I work with, um, needed to reinvigorate its line of podcasts. And so we had a brainstorming session about what types of shows might we want to create. And I said, well, I could do a show on mysterious subjects. And that ended up becoming Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. So every Friday these days, we look at a mysterious topic. It could be a scientific mystery, it could be a historical mystery, it could be a biblical mystery, it could be a supernatural mystery, a paranormal mystery. It could be UFOs. It could be Bigfoot. It has been the Loch Ness Monster. It could be psychic powers. It could be true crime. It could be anything that is connected with a mystery in some way. And we look at them from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. We lay out the background of the mystery, what's claimed about it. And then we look at it and say, what would the faith have to say about this? And sometimes the answer is not much. This doesn't contradict the faith. I mean, like if we're looking at a true crime thing, well, okay, murder bad. But beyond that, the faith, it doesn't really impact the faith. And then we say, what would reason tell us? And unlike a lot of mystery based shows, we actually try to solve the mysteries to the extent that's possible. We don't just want to generate wonder and encourage the audience to imagine what if. We actually want to try to solve the mysteries to the extent we can. And so, as a matter of self discipline, I have a bottom line segment at the end of each show where I give my bottom line on a mystery and say, here's what I think the evidence best supports.
Mm. Do you know how many people tune into your show?
Not exactly, but we estimate something like 200,000 listeners a week.
Okay, very cool. And was there a specific, I guess, what mystery that you guys looked into fascinated you the most?
Oh, you're asking me to do favorites again, and my mind doesn't work that way.
Okay.
There have been mysteries that I've changed my mind on that, once I looked into the evidence, I was surprised. And typically, in terms of what's my favorite, it's frequently one of the most recent ones I've done. And just because I've just recently been doing the research and it's been of interest to me, and then it changes. as I research different topics, I get interested in them and I get excited about them for a while. So it tends to what I personally am feeling tends to change fairly frequently as I research different topics, usually based on recency. The more recent something is, the more it'll spring to mind as something that was particularly interesting to me. There have been, though, some that were surprising, um, like the Mad Gasser of Matoon was an incident that occurred back in the 1940s in Mattoon, Illinois, and there were all these reports of someone using an anesthetizing gas to try to put people to sleep. And this is widely regarded as a case of mass hysteria, that there was no gasser and it was all a popular delusion. But when I looked into the case, it's actually no, there is evidence that there was a mad gasser, and we even have evidence about who it was. So that was one. Another that was like that was the mystery airships of the 1890s, where in 1896 and especially in 1897, there were all these reports of mysterious airships appearing in the skies. At first on the West Coast, and then in the interior of the nation. And these have often been reported as like early UFOs. But when you study them, they were not understood as UFOs. They were not reported like UFOs. They were reported as, we've got some inventors who have invented a new kind of dirigible and or directable balloon, and people thought they were a new invention, and they didn't report meeting aliens. In fact, they reported meeting human crews with names, and when you check out those names, they were real people. And so it looks like we did have a group of inventors that were testing out some new airships in 1896 and 1897, and that one turns out to be true, even and not alien related. So that was another example. Also in the 1990s, there was a woman named Gloria Ramirez who was taken to a hospital in Orange County, California. And this actually became the basis of an X-Files episode because it was so strange. When they punctured her, to give her, she was having a heart attack. When they tried giving her an intravenous feed, this smell overwhelmed the people in the emergency room, and they had to like evacuate and things like that. And so she's been referred, and unfortunately she passed away, but she's referred to as the toxic woman. And the question is, what on earth happened in her situation? Was it a case of hysteria, or what else might it be? And they actually used it at the end of the first season on the X-Files, where it was a woman who had alien DNA in her. Well, the evidence is that there is a solution to the Gloria Ramirez mystery, and it wasn't aliens, and it wasn't it wasn't mass hysteria. It looks like someone in the hospital in Orange County, which was the head of, or the sometimes spoken of as like the world headquarters of meth production, had been making precursors for methamphetamines and storing the precursors in IV bags in the hospital so they could conveniently be smuggled. And when they were hooking up the tubes to give Gloria Ramirez IV, they grabbed accidentally one of the bags of the methamphetamine precursors. And that's what caused the strange ammonia-like smell that overcame everybody in the emergency room. So it looks like it was actually a criminal enterprise that went wrong and caused this as an accident. So that would be another one that I looked at where I didn't know what the answer was going to be until I looked into the evidence. Also, all three of those I just mentioned are more on the normal side of things. One thing I was very surprised at once I started researching was the evidence for psychic functioning is much more robust than than most people realize. And so I had to revise my view on that. Initially, I was much more skeptical, but we actually have significant scientific evidence for psychic functioning in humans.
Okay, can you explain that? Like, what that means entirely?
Well, not entirely, or I'd have a Nobel Prize,
Okay.
um, but basically, there have been reports in all cultures throughout the world that people sometimes have experiences that, even though they're considered totally normal experiences in many cultures, they're considered paranormal in our culture. And these include experiences like having information about the future, which today is called precognition, or having information about what someone else is thinking, which is today called telepathy, or information about what's happening at a distant or hidden location, which is called clairvoyance, or having the ability to influence things at a distance, which is called psychokinesis. And those are the four basic forms of psychic functioning: precognition, telepathy, clairvoyance, and psychokinesis. And beginning in the late 1800s, scientists started to take an interest in these experiences, and they formed several scientific societies with, like Nobel Prize winners as among their members, who then did what was then called psychical research. In the 20th century, there was some new jargon that came in, and this came to be called parapsychology instead of psychical research, but it's the same thing. And in particular, in the 20th century, they started doing a lot of laboratory tests on psychic functioning, and they've actually gotten a lot better results than most people are aware of.
Oh, okay. So, also, can
Oh,
you
and incidentally, there's a history of this in Christian thought too. If you go down through the ages, you have various saints and so forth, and this is all through the Bible too. But you have various saints reporting experiences that are sometimes precognitive, or sometimes clairvoyant, or sometimes telepathic. But even and sometimes they're attributed to God. But you also have thinkers that'll look at some of these experiences and say they're the result of natural human ability, that God built in to mankind. So, for example, St. Thomas Aquinas would talk about two kinds of prophecy. Supernatural prophecy is what God gives, and it's infallible. Natural, what Aquinas called natural prophecy, is a natural human ability that God built into us that is not infallible, but does, at least in a probabilistic way, give us information about the future. And so this has a long history. Now, he didn't have the word precognition, but that's what he's talking about: a natural human ability that lets you pick up on certain information about the future. He also believed in what today would be called psychokinesis, which is the ability to influence things at a distance. This was Aquinas's explanation for the evil eye. He said, if the soul is venomously moved by hatred, it can infect your gaze, which can create an influence that can be transmitted to someone else, and that like frail people, like old people or children, are particularly vulnerable to this. And today that would be classified as a form of psychokinesis. And he thought it was a purely natural human ability.
wow. And what about the remote viewing piece?
Yeah, so that is basically a form of clairvoyance that the term remote viewing was applied to it beginning in the 1970s. Um, the Defense Department started, well, actually, before the Defense Department, there were some scientists connected with the Stanford Research Institute and SAIC, which is a major defense contractor, that began looking at evidence for clairvoyance, which came to be called remote viewing, and they found evidence of it, that it exists, and people can be trained to do it and stuff. And so the Defense Department was hearing about the Soviets are doing this is during the Cold War. They're hearing that the Soviets are doing research in terms of psychic functioning and We don't want to be left behind if they are finding this stuff out. So the Defense Department started looking into it. And between the 1970s and the 1990s, they had a classified program within the Defense Department that was basically a clairvoyant psychic spying unit. It went under a number of different names. It got called things like Center Lane and Grill Flame, and because they have to change their code names periodically. Its final code name was Stargate, and they had two words, Stargate, and they had the name before the movie and the TV show. Um, but yeah, it was a real government program. I've met people who were involved. I mean, I have them on speed dial. So it's a real program that did exist, and people continue to study this to this day.
So then I imagine you diving in all these mysteries and whatnot, you get your mind blown almost on a weekly basis.
Well, I don't know about blown on a weekly basis, but I definitely get to study and research very interesting things.
I think I saw one of them was the, Apparitions of Mary that happened
I
back
have
in the I think one notable one was, like, the Lady Fatima or something like that?
Our Lady of Fatima, yeah, back in
Yes.
1917 in Portugal.
Yes. Do you think that event truly happened?
Oh, yeah. Well, the event definitely happened. The question is,
Yes.
was it exotic or not? And, was it paranormal or supernatural or something? And I think the evidence is yes, it was.
Whoa. Because there's multiple events like that that happened throughout the 1900s, weren't there?
Yeah, I've covered quite a number of them.
Okay, that is so fascinating. And going towards the UFO route too, have you guys covered or are you planning on covering the whole orbs that have been going on in the sky as of late?
Well, okay, so I'm sure we'll mention them. Um, I I I periodically do episodes on UFO related themes. Um, just so people know where I stand, I'm open to the idea that there is intelligent life elsewhere in our universe. I'm open to the idea that it is visiting us, but I have yet to see what I would consider convincing proof that it's visiting us. So I'm kind of a healthy agnostic on that subject. I don't dismiss it. I don't just believe it all. I'm open, but I also think critically. And there are things I don't know how to explain, like some of the encounters, like the Tic Tac incident from 2004 that our military was involved in. And it's like, yeah, well, this is very hard to explain in non-exotic terms, but I don't know exactly what it was. When you mention orbs specifically, that can refer to a couple of different things. One thing it often refers to is little artifacts of, like circular lights that people see on film, or recordings. And almost always it, it appears in two contexts. One of them is UFO phenomena, and the other is ghostly phenomena. When it appears in an apparently ghostly context, the orbs that you see on film are almost always purely natural in origin. They reflect things like dust motes and lens flares and they're artifacts of the camera process. So when people say, "Oh, I took photos, and when I looked back at the photos, I saw these orbs," yeah, that's an artifact of your camera. That's not anything supernatural. That's a bug. It's a piece of dust. It's a reflection. It's a lens flare. It's one of those things. Very easy to generate orbs in that way. Then, when they appear in the UFO context, okay, there are reports of UFOs that are like lights in a distance. It's a little hard to know what a light in the distance is. Could be something purely natural. If it's up close, there are reports of spherical UFOs that appear in the daytime as like metallic orbs or at night as like glowing orbs. Exactly what they are is not clear. What's been in the news most recently is drones that have been reported, notably in New Jersey, but also in other places. These don't look like, now some of them may be unusual drones and have unusual characteristics, like they're larger than normal, like recreational drones. Um, and there are a number of possible explanations for them, but the explanations don't tend to point in the direction, to my mind, of being anything exotic. They meaning a product of non-human intelligence. They it looks like we have a collection of different factors that people are reporting as drones. Some of them are actually regular airplanes. Some of them are stars. Some of them are drones that are perfectly ordinary, like recreational drones. There may be some high-end commercial or military and not from the US military drones that are involved, but they look like they're all of terrestrial origin at this point.
Wow, and I just remembered, did you debate Hugh Ross on this subject?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, what was the topic again exactly?
Whether all aliens are demons.
Okay, okay, because he was on the obviously, he was probably, I assume, he thought they were all demons.
Yeah.
Okay.
And my position was, well, if some of them might be demons, but you need evidence to show that, and his arguments
Yeah.
aren't persuasive.
Yes, okay. Yeah, I agree with that big time. So then, I guess for you with aliens, then what would be kind of the lowest tier of evidence that you would accept to be convinced that there are, I guess, non-human intelligences out there?
Well, I can imagine any number of different types of evidence that I would find convincing. Having a robustly verifiable piece of technology that was not made by humans, um, would be convincing. This might be obtainable, for example, if we had a piece of machinery or a significant chunk of a piece of machinery that had really weird isotopic ratios in it. So there are different, uh, I guess I should explain. There are three different types of categories you put atoms into: ions, elements, and isotopes. What element something is based on the number of protons that it has. So if an element has one proton in it, that makes it helium. Hydrogen. If it has two protons in it, that makes it helium. If it has three, that makes it lithium, and so on. Then there are two other major kinds of subatomic particles, though, which are the electrons and the neutrons. So how many electrons it has tells you what ion it is. So if it's got one proton, that makes it hydrogen, but it could have zero electrons, it could have one electron, it might have two electrons if it's in some weird state, and that gives you a different ion of hydrogen. Then there are neutrons, and how many neutrons an atom has tells you what isotope it is. So that's why you hear about like carbon 14 in radioactive dating. Carbon 14 carbon is element 6, and that means it has six protons. And then it has, in addition to the six protons, if it's got eight neutrons, that means it's got 14 total particles in its nucleus, and that makes it carbon 14. But if it only had 7 neutrons, it would be carbon 13. If it had 6 neutrons, it would be carbon 12, and so on. So you have these different ions of carbon. They're all carbon, but based on the number of neutrons in them, they're different isotopes of carbon. Well, it so happens that everything in our solar system was birthed out of the same cosmic dust cloud. And so you find similar ratios of the isotopes of the different elements from anywhere in our solar system. But if you found something that had really, really different isotope ratios than what you find in our solar system, that would suggest this was built in another solar system using matter that came from there. And so if we had a piece of technology that could do things that were just way beyond what current human technology can do, if we had something that was made out of really different isotopes, that would be significant evidence. And we do have some claims in that regard, but I would want to see more than what we currently have in terms of claimed pieces of material from UFOs. Also, if we had biological materials that are based on DNA that is not terrestrial in nature, like we have four nucleotides in our DNA that are often abbreviated G, A, T, and C. Well, if you've got something that doesn't have G, A, T, and C, but maybe it's got an X and a Y in there as nucleotides, that would suggest this is non-terrestrial life because X and Y are not nucleotides in any terrestrial life. So that would be convincing. Or if one, walked up to the president of the United States and shook his hand and negotiated a treaty, that would convince me. But um, I think the sightings that we have right now are very interesting, and we can look for patterns in those sightings and try to figure out things based on those patterns, but we won't have proof until we move into a further stage of evidence acquisition.
Mm. And I wanna ask you this too, because I almost forgot. Have you yourself had a supernatural encounter before?
Well, it depends on what you mean by supernatural. The way so technically speaking, in theology, the term supernatural is used to refer to something that God Himself does. So technically, in theology, if an angel does something, it's actually technically not supernatural; it's preternatural. Preter is a Latin preposition that means outside. So supernatural, super means above in Latin. So we theologians use the term supernatural for things that God, who has a nature above human nature, does. They would say that if an angel does something, well, that's outside of nature, but it's not supernatural. It doesn't require what God could do. Other people use the term supernaturally more loosely. Some of them use it to refer to just things that are paranormal, like psychic functioning, like having a precognitive experience. Um, so to kind of cover the range, I have had some experiences that I think were either supernatural in the theological sense, meaning God Himself did them, or He had an angel do them. And these include some providential coincidences that happened when my wife was in the process of dying, which was, I'm a widower. And there were some very strange things that happened that I'm very blessed to have had happen that were very unlikely to have had happen. And I see the hand of God in those. So I would say those were genuinely supernatural experiences. When it comes to other things, I've never seen a UFO. I've never seen a Bigfoot. I have had precognitive experiences. And so like I had a precognitive dream when I was a teenager that was like a videotape of what happened the very next day. And I had this, so I'll tell you the story just briefly, but I had this dream. I dreamed I was in my art class and I was painting, but for some reason I was painting on a flat surface, not like on an easel, because normally you put your painting on an easel that you're working on. But for some reason I was painting on a flat surface with purple and green tempera paint. And a guy in the class named Lyndon McDonald, who didn't like me, came up and said, "What do you think you're doing?" And so the next morning, I related this dream to a friend of mine who was in the art class. His name was Charlie. And and so I told Charlie about my dream. And then we go into art class that day, and our teacher pulls us off of all of the projects we're going to be working on. So none of us are working on what we had been working on. We're putting those to one side because the school is having a carnival. And she had agreed to have us, her art students, paint these big photo flats, the kind where they cut out, they paint a character on it, they cut out the character's face, you put your face through, and they take a picture of you. You see these at carnivals, or at least you did. I assume you still do. Well, she had volunteered us, her students, to make these for the carnival. And she, to that end, she had acquired a bunch of big refrigerator boxes that she'd flattened, and we were going to paint the cutouts on the refrigerator boxes. Well, there's no way to fit a refrigerator box on an easel, so we had to lay them flat on the tables. And so here I am painting on this refrigerator box, and the character she assigned me to paint was the Incredible Hulk. So I'm painting a cardboard cutout of the Incredible Hulk with his green skin and his purple pants. And I'm painting here with green and purple tempera paint. And Lyndon McDonald comes up and says, "What do you think you're doing?" And Charlie was standing right there watching this, and his mouth just fell open, because he had heard the dream before it happened, and then he saw it fulfilled. So this was a precognitive experience. And I would put it in the purely natural category because it doesn't seem to have any religious significance or anything. It's not like God was sending me a message about the end of the world or something. This is just a little thing that happened, and it was, unlikely to happen, and thus it looks like a case of a precognitive dream, which actually fits what the data suggests. There was a researcher named Louisa Rhyme back in the mid 20th century, and she did statistical studies of spontaneous psychic experiences that people would report, and she found that when people reported spontaneous precognitive experiences, 60% of the time it occurred in the context of a realistic dream, which is what it did for me. This was a dream. It was realistic. It was not symbolic. It was just like a videotape of what would happen the next day. And that represents about 60%. That kind of experience represents about 60% of the precognitive experiences that people spontaneously report.
Wow. Oh my goodness, that's so interesting. Oh, sorry, we have a few more questions. Are you still good on time?
Oh, sure.
Okay, great. My next question was gonna be, I'm curious, what do you think you would be doing if you weren't working in a Christian field, if you didn't have, Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World? What do you think you'd be doing otherwise, from, like, a career
Well,
standpoint?
I might still have Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World because that's not a uniquely Christian thing, and I'm not making my living off of that. I actually don't get any money from that. Um, but if I was not working professionally in a Christian field as an apologist or whatever, I would probably my next backup would have been philosophy. I would have pursued a career, God willing, as a philosophy professor, and sort of the second backup from that would be law. Um, I at one point I have a kind of a legal mind, and this was something that was pointed out to me back when I was an undergrad in college. I had my political science professor kind of take me aside and say, I being a political science professor, I see a lot of people who want to go into law, and most of them don't have the talent, but you do. And so I just wanted you to understand that that's an option for you. And there was a point at which, I won't go into all the reasons why, where I looked more seriously at law as a career. And I got as far as taking the legal skills aptitude test, or LSAT. And I actually scored quite well, even though I had to rush into the test and was unrattled for it. I still scored in the 91st percentile. Of people who've taken the test. So I did well on it. And I'm sure I would do well in law, but it's not my, and even these days I engage in law, like canon law. Um, so I get to use some of those skills, but philosophy would have been my preferred route. So religion, philosophy, and law are the three areas. And I'm fortunate that I landed in the one that I wanted the most.
That's very cool. And obviously, you seem like a guy, I imagine, that's very into pop culture, like movies, fiction books as well.
Yeah.
You obviously indulge in nonfiction because of philosophy and other things. Do you have I hate to ask you this because I know it's asking for your favorites again, but I guess what are there specific, I guess, films you find the most enjoyment in out of
Yeah.
others?
Yeah. I mean, that's not as long as you give as long as you don't say what's your favorite, meaning only one. I can tell you what I like. That's no problem.
Sure.
So in terms of films, Citizen Kane is a really, really great film. Um, and and it's in the sort of realistic fiction by historical type genre. Um, what else? I really like The Maltese Falcon. I like The Big Sleep. The Big Sleep is very hard to follow. It has a convoluted plot, but it's so good. Who cares? I like Psycho as a horror film. I like Wait Until Dark with Audrey Hepburn as a thriller. I like um, a film almost no one has heard of called Elevator Trap, which is a Japanese film. It's another thriller. It's also a comedy. It's about four people who are stuck in an elevator together. And as the story goes on, you learn how they came to be in the elevator and what hidden connections there are between the people that not all of them know about from the very beginning. Um, but Elevator Trap is a really great movie. It's very hard to find though. Other films that I've seen, I like the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Just bunches of stuff.
Was the first ones you named up until the Lord of the Rings trilogy, were those all black and white?
No, not all of them. Elevator Trap is color. That came out in the 2000s. And Wait Until Dark with Audrey Hepburn, that came out in the late 60s. So that's color.
Okay. What was the best, I guess, could you depict the best movie theater experience you've had?
Oh, if the movie's good, I don't notice the theater.
Oh, okay. Cool. What are your favorite non or fiction books as well?
Nonfiction or fiction?
Fiction.
Fiction. Okay. Well, I like the work of Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle. I'll also mention another movie for you. This one is black and white, but it's very recent. It's called Hundreds of Beavers. It is spectacular. It is, yes, it is well worth watching. It is a slapstick comedy made it came out in 2024. It's made in black and white. It is hilarious. And it just builds and builds and builds and goes more and more out there. But Hundreds of Beavers. It is about a fur trapper in the northern woods in wintertime and his dealings with hundreds of beavers. Yeah. Um, in any event, so for fiction, you said, well, I like a lot of science fiction. I like the write-ins of Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle, especially what they did together. Two of their books that I particularly like are The Mote in God's Eye, which is about humanity's first encounter with an first discovery of an alien intelligence 1,000 years in the future, and it is astonishingly well done. It is just phenomenal. Um, Midway, we meet this race. They live on a planet surrounding a star that's known as the Mote, Mote. And like a mote you might have in your eye, a little speck you'd have in your eye. And so they live on this on this planet around this star called the Mote. So they're known as Motes. They're very different than us. They're divided into different castes, and so like each caste is really good at one thing. Like you've got doctors who are phenomenal, but otherwise than being a doctor, they're not really that intelligent. Or you have engineers who are really phenomenal, but other than being good at engineering, they're not that intelligent. And so they have this kind of race divided by caste in terms of their skills. And then there are masters who are really good at commanding their family, but not really smart at anything else. The characters we get to know the most are the mediators, whose job is to help different families of Modis not fight each other. And so their skill is not figuring out what to do, but figuring out how to do it in the most beneficial way. And so we meet these Modis. They're the first intelligent creatures we found after 1,000 years in space. And partway through the story, and the mediators are super friendly and everything. They want everything to go well for everybody. And halfway through the novel, we learn they're hiding a terrible secret. And once we learn what it is, we feel enormous sympathy for them. This is not the Modi's fault. But wow, how are we going to live in the same universe together, or should we wipe them out while we still have the chance? Um, and so it is a gripping story as you get down to the final pages. Are they going to find a solution that'll let us live together, or should we wipe them all out now? Another one they did that I really like is called Footfall, which is also about a first contact, but it's set much closer to our time. It's actually set in the late 20th century. We meet an alien race that are kind of based on elephants. They're kind of like earthly elephants. They're a herd animal, and they're not that much in advance of us. They don't have faster than light. They manage to get to our solar system, with a slower than light ship, and they're really only about 50 years ahead of us. But the way their culture works, the first thing you do when you meet another herd of elephants is you establish dominance. And so they meet us. Their first instinct is to establish dominance over humanity by dropping an asteroid into the Indian Ocean, which causes a tidal wave that decimates human civilization. And they refer to that as the foot. Because when they establish dominance, they put their foot on someone. So the asteroid they drop into the Indian Ocean is the foot. And humanity then has to respond. But humanity is not a bunch of herd animals. So we don't have a herd surrender reflex the way they do. With them, once you've established dominance, the other people surrender to you and become part of your herd. Humans don't do that. And you decimate human civilization, and you got a million mad monkey people who are ready to do anything to end you. And so, since we're otherwise pretty evenly matched, they're only about 50 years ahead of us, and humans are creative individualists rather than herd animals. We have an interesting competition. And humanity comes out on top, and there is a great moment towards the end of the book where one of the characters has to put his human foot on one of the aliens for their surrender. And leading up to that moment, there is an instance where the aliens realize if they don't surrender, we will end them. And it is explained to them, this is the price of the foot. What you did in the Indian Ocean will lead to your extinction if you don't surrender now. We will kill all of you because of what you did to us. And you just want to cheer when, this is the price of the foot. It is an extreme situation produced by necessity, but they are able to negotiate a modus vivendi, a way that both races can survive. So those are a couple of science fiction novels I really like, Mote in God's Eye and Footfall. I've read all of Sherlock Holmes multiple times, and they're of different quality. Some Sherlock Holmes is really good. Some Sherlock Holmes it's not really good. But I know all the stories, so it's comfort in listening if I'm trying to fall asleep or something. I'll just have my device read the complete Sherlock Holmes to me.
Yeah. You took me for a Stephen King guy. Are you not a Stephen King guy?
Well, I read some Stephen King when I was younger, so I've read things like Firestarter and stuff like that, but I haven't read Stephen King since I was in high school or college.
Okay. There's one I think you'd like. It's called 11/22/63. It's about a
Oh,
time
yeah.
traveler.
I've
Okay.
I've I've seen the TV version of that.
Oh, you have? Okay. Okay, so you're familiar with the plot then.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's
And
his imaginative take on the Kennedy assassination.
yes, yes, precisely. And since we're already here, let's can we dive into your nonfictions then?
Sure. So, okay, so nonfiction books, you wanna know religious nonfiction or non-religious nonfiction?
Let's go both. I wanna hear just, like, the masterpieces that you've read.
Okay, so in terms of religious nonfiction, a book that I would highly recommend an author. He's a British author. His name is Richard Bauckham, Bauckham. He has written a bunch of stuff. I don't always agree with him, but he is always worth listening to. He wrote a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, which I highly recommend to anyone who has an interest in the Gospels or apologetics. He also wrote a book or edited a book called The Gospels for All Christians, which is another fascinating read. And he wrote a book of essays on Revelation called The Climax of Prophecy, which is well worth reading. Bauckham is someone, almost anything he publishes, I would buy. He is a really top-notch scholar. Now, I should mention, I don't read a lot of popular level religious literature. I tend to read more scholarly stuff. So that's what you're going to get from me on average. On the other hand, I have read popular stuff. I've read C.S. Lewis, and so I'd recommend him. Um, those are two authors that I would recommend: C.S. Lewis on the popular level and Richard Bauckham on the scholarly level. In terms of non-religious nonfiction, a book I really like is called The Day the Universe Changed. Or sorry, not The Day the Universe Changed. That's a TV show. The Day We Discovered the Universe. It is a book about astronomy and how we figured out the basic structure of the universe. Because this is even 100 years ago in the 1920s, we didn't have the idea that the universe is mostly empty and full of galaxies and we live in a galaxy. That was not well established. They actually in the 1920s had a debate in astronomy. It was called the Great Debate. They had a debate about, is the Milky Way the only thing in the universe or not? And so this idea that we live in a sea of galaxies, that's actually really recent. And so the day we found the universe is a really good treatment of this as a popular science work, helping you understand the development of cosmology and how we figured out the way the universe is based. Another one that I really like is called The Disappearing Spoon. And The Disappearing Spoon is about the elements and how they were discovered and what you can do with them and all kinds of interesting things like that. So I like The Disappearing Spoon as non-religious nonfiction. I like two books by nuclear physicist James Mahaffey. These are both histories, so you don't have to know nuclear physics. But his book, Atomic Accidents, is really good. It is like a dark comedy because it's a history of atomic accidents. So every chapter, here are new characters, and you just watch stuff go wrong. and and then Mahaffey, with a historical perspective, shows the lessons that we've learned from the different accidents that have happened with atomic materials historically and how we've learned from them and how things are better now as a result. But each individual chapter is kind of like a dark comedy movie. You watch these characters and it's like, okay, here come the mistakes. Yeah, you don't want to do that. So Atomic Accidents is really good. Also, he has another book called Atomic Adventures, which is not entirely focused on accidents. It's focused on other things that people have done with nuclear materials, many of which are quite wild, but not accidents per se. So Mahaffey's Atomic Accidents and Atomic Adventures, I both recommend. Also, there's a book called 13 Things That Don't Make Sense, which looks at 13 scientific mysteries of things that are really strange and hard to figure out. Um, Few of them have been solved since the book came out, but it's a very interesting study. What the author says about free will is not actually accurate, but the rest of the chapters are good. So those would be some nonfiction books I could recommend.
Cool, appreciate that.
You may notice, those were all scientific. If you want some history, read in, the Roman historian Suetonius. His Lives of the 12 Caesars is a good entry point into, ancient Roman history. It's very entertaining. Oh, and thinking of that, in terms of fiction, I would recommend Robert Graves's 2 books, I, Claudius and Claudius the God and his wife Messalina, both of which are a look at the beginning of the Roman Empire and are, even though they're written as historical fiction, it is very tightly sourced historical fiction. And so it's based on ancient Roman sources. He's imagined it.
Oh, man, that's so interesting. Okay, cool. I gotta look those up and get to reading on those.
There's
One
also a really great 1975 BBC miniseries of I, Claudius that is well worth watching. It is not for the faint of heart, because it does depict, I mean, it's not like pornographic, because this was broadcast on the BBC in the 1970s, but there are very disturbing bits of it, more based on what you don't see than what you do, but it is astonishingly well acted.
mm, one question we consistently ask.
And
Oh,
I gotta tell you
go
my
ahead, go
favorite
ahead.
story from my Claudius. So, so the Emperor Caligula precedes Claudius, and he's such a terrible emperor that his own guards kill him. But before he's killed, he begins to have delusions of godhood. He wants to be worshipped as Zeus because Zeus is the god who's closest to me. He's not on my level exactly, but he's the closest to me. So you can refer to me as Zeus. He also thinks he's the Jewish Messiah. And so then at the end of I, Claudius, as when Claudius is an old man, he's given his farewell speech to the Senate and he kind of zones out and he has a vision of all the people he's known in his life. And they each come up to him and say something in the order that he met them. And and he sees Caligula coming up to him, and Caligula's predecessor Tiberius is like, "Wait your turn, boy." And then Tiberius says something to Claudius. And then when Caligula finally gets to Claudius, he says, "Guess what, Uncle Claudius? I wasn't that Messiah after all. You could have knocked me over with a feather when they told me." You have this delusional kid from Rome who thought he was the Jewish Messiah, found out he wasn't.
Oh, man, that's great. Uh, one question we like to consistently ask our guests on our show is, what is one question you would ask God if you knew for a fact you'd get an answer right there? What would your question be?
Well, I can tell you what it would be. Um, the first thing that I would ask off the top of my head, would be, what do I need to do to help others the most? Um, I might refine the question into something like, it depends on how much time I had to think about it. But if I had time to think and refined it, I might be something like, what do I most need to know to help people, either other people or myself? Because that's what we're about in this world, is loving other people. And so the greatest way to serve God is going to be helping other people in some form. It's, the two great commandments are love God and love your neighbor. And so by asking this question, I would be seeking to serve God to the greatest of my ability by figuring out how can I best serve others, and asking, what do I need to know to do that, would be the basic information I'm after. If it's a mere curiosity question, as opposed to a practical question, then, I mean, if you just tell me any question, I'm going to ask the practical one. What
Sure.
do I need to know? But even if it's a curiosity question, I would tend to, I don't, the problem is, I, there are lots of unknown unknowns out there, things I don't know that I don't know, but God knows them. And so my inclination is to defer to God in terms of, even in terms of curiosity questions and say, God, tell me the thing that I would find most interesting to know about and let him,
Mm.
because he knows better than I do what I would find most interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, those are good. I like those a lot. Well, Jimmy, thanks a lot for coming on. This was a blast. Is there any other thoughts or wisdom you want to share with the audience?
Nope, just happy to come on and happy to speak with you and your audience. Hope y'all find it interesting.
Great. That is Jimmy Akin. Thanks for coming on.
My pleasure.